So, um, if you are watching the geopolitical landscape right now,
Which you probably are.
right, exactly, you are witnessing a really fundamental rewrite of how the United States approaches the world.
Yeah, it's a massive shift.
It is. And today we're focusing entirely on this profound and incredibly rapid shift in foreign policy, specifically concerning the escalating conflict in Iran.
Hmm.
Whether you are listening on your commute or sitting at your desk right now, the strategic realignment we're examining today, it it alters rules of international engagement that have just been taken for granted for decades.
They really have. And to understand the mechanics of this shift, we are leaning on some really excellent recent reporting by Anton Troyanovsky,
In the New York Times.
right, in the New York Times. And the reporting takes a very close look at the rhetoric, the stated military strategies, and really the underlying philosophy that is currently driving the White House's actions in Iran.
So the goal today is to examine the death of a long-held geopolitical doctrine.
Exactly. We're looking at what it means when a superpower adopts this disruptor mindset,
Yeah, a disruptor mindset.
and how that strategic pivot impacts not just the United States and Iran, but the global security architecture as a whole.
So before we look at the current strategy, I think it helps to understand the baseline of what is actually being discarded here.
Right. The old rules.
The old rules. For a generation, Washington has basically operated under this unwritten law of foreign intervention. It's colloquially known as the Pottery Barn Rule.
Yeah, the Pottery Barn Rule. That term became famous right in the lead up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq.
Originating with Colin Powell, right?
Right. It was a stark warning from then Secretary of State Colin Powell to President George W. Bush. And the phrase is incredibly simple. You break it, you own it.
You break it, you own it.
Exactly. And in a geopolitical context, that implies a massive burden of responsibility. If the United States military goes in and topples a sovereign government, the United States inherently assumes responsibility for managing the vacuum that gets left behind.
So what does owning it actually look like in practice? Like when a nation's government actually falls?
Well, I mean, it means total granular responsibility for a society's survival.
Right.
Because when a central government collapses, everything stops. The police no longer patrol the streets.
The central bank stops functioning.
Exactly, which means the currency collapses and people literally cannot buy food. Water treatment plants, power grids, hospitals, they all lose their funding and their supply chains.
Everything just halts.
Yeah. Owning it means the invading military suddenly has to become the de facto police force. They become the utility provider, the central bank.
You're attempting to build an entirely new institutional framework from scratch.
Exactly. Establishing courts, writing constitutions, creating a monopoly on violence just so everyday citizens can safely walk outside.
And based on the current reporting, the administration is making a highly public pivot away from that responsibility.
A total pivot.
They are discarding the Pottery Barn Rule entirely. The new stance is transitioning from you break it, you own it, to a starkly uncompromising we break it, they own it.
Yeah, the actions and the statements detailed in the reporting represent a complete abandonment of the concept of nation building. The administration is essentially signaling that they're willing to apply the military force necessary to shatter a hostile state apparatus.
But they're categorically refusing to take ownership of the aftermath.
Exactly. They won't touch the aftermath.
And I want to pause here just to establish right away that the purpose of our deep dive today is not to evaluate the morality or the political validity of this shift.
Right, we need to be clear about that.
This conflict involves highly polarized, deeply charged content. There are passionate arguments from every side of the political spectrum.
We are not endorsing any of the viewpoints or strategies or criticisms involved here.
No, the objective is to impartially report on the facts on the ground as they are documented. We want to examine the rhetoric being utilized by the administration and understand the strategic rationale they are presenting.
Basically, we want to provide you with the framework to understand how this new doctrine actually operates in the real world.
Right, so analyzing the architecture of this strategy, it starts with a very revealing interaction in the Oval Office.
Yeah, this is fascinating. The reporting details a recent meeting between President Trump and the German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz.
And the dynamic in that room really highlights a severe point of friction between the U.S. and a major European ally.
It does. Chancellor Merz came into that meeting expressing acute anxiety about the military campaign in Iran.
He was focused almost entirely on what he referred to as the day after.
Right, the day after, because European leadership approaches a conflict like this through a very different lens.
Yeah.
Merce is looking past the kinetic military action and focusing on the systemic collapse. A regime falling in Tehran does not happen in a vacuum. It creates an immediate security crisis for Europe.
And for regional powers like Israel.
Exactly. Mertz's anxiety is rooted in the practical realities of state collapse. I mean, if 90 million people suddenly find themselves in a country without a functioning economy or internal security.
The result is massive refugee flows heading toward European borders.
Exactly. It means unsecured military arsenals, the fracturing of regional trade routes, the creation of safe havens for extremist factions. Merz was essentially asking the administration, how does the United States plan to manage the global fallout of breaking the Iranian state?
And the response to that anxiety was incredibly brief.
7 words.
Yeah. President Trump told Chancellor Merz, we'll see what happens with the people.
We'll see what happens with the people. Those 7 words encapsulate the new doctrine perfectly.
Right.
By stating we'll see what happens with the people, the administration is doing something completely counter to traditional diplomatic reassurances.
They are openly acknowledging that the outcome of their military campaign is entirely uncertain.
Yeah, the reporting notes that the administration accepts a worst-case scenario is on the table.
Meaning a leader who is equally hostile, or even more dangerous, could seize power if the current regime falls.
Right. They are fully aware that the aftermath could be disastrous, but they're proceeding with the military campaign anyway.
It's a strategy of calculated detachment.
Exactly. Calculated detachment. They are separating the objective of weakening the regime from the responsibility of what replaces it.
The message to the Iranian population is basically the U.S. will break the apparatus of the state, but the responsibility for fixing the vacuum falls entirely on the local citizens.
The United States is challenging the population to build a new government while explicitly washing its hands of any obligation to provide security or financial support during that transition.
It's kind of like intentionally crashing a company's servers to force out a corrupt executive board.
Right.
And then expecting the entry-level employees to code a new operating system from scratch while the building is actively on fire.
That is a very apt analogy.
And this isn't an isolated, off-the-cuff philosophy from one meeting. The reporting makes it clear that this detachment is a unified, synchronized strategy echoed across the highest levels of the administration.
Yeah, the metrics for success have been completely redefined. Look at Vice President J.D. Vance. He has articulated a very specific lens for evaluating this conflict. He stated that his primary condition for success, the main metric he is looking at, is whether Iran is prevented from building a nuclear weapon.
And he explicitly noted that as long as the nuclear objective is achieved, the administration is happy with the outcome.
Happy with the outcome. That framing essentially renders everything else collateral damage.
Local stability, the humanitarian crisis, the specific nature of whatever government eventually emerges.
These are all secondary concerns, or perhaps not concerns at all. It is a hyper-focused definition of victory that ignores the broader societal impact of the war.
And the diplomatic angle reinforces this narrow focus. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who traditionally would be managing the delicate international diplomacy of a regime transition.
He aligns perfectly with this detachment. Rubio stated that the objective of the military campaign is not per se to help the Iranian people.
He added that the administration is open to it.
Open to it.
Yeah.
But humanitarian or democratic outcomes are fundamentally not the driving purpose of the operation.
Describing a superpower as merely open to the welfare of the civilian population during a massive bombing campaign that is a stark departure from how the U.S. usually frames its interventions.
It really is. But the rhetoric becomes even more visceral when you look at statements from Senator Lindsey Graham and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth.
Senator Graham provides probably the bluntest rejection of the traditional rules of engagement.
Yeah, he explicitly discarded the "you break it, you own it" concept. He stated clearly that it is not his job to plan the political future for 90 million Iranians.
He's drawing a hard, impenetrable boundary between utilizing American military force and assuming any responsibility for the socio-political devastation that follows.
And then Defense Secretary Hegseth took that sentiment a step further by actively disparaging the previous models of American warfare.
Right. He referred to the last 20 years of nation-building efforts, specifically pointing to the prolonged wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, as dumb.
Dumb.
Yeah.
And he explicitly framed the current campaign in Iran as the exact opposite of those previous conflicts.
Hegseth is solidifying the administration's core argument here.
Right. They view the attempt to rebuild a shattered nation not as a moral obligation, nor as a strategic necessity to ensure long-term regional peace. They view it as a foolish waste of American blood and treasure.
The underlying argument is that the catastrophic mistake of the Afghan and Iraq wars was not the initial use of force to topple the governments.
Right, the mistake was the trillions of dollars and decades spent trying to establish new institutions in their wake.
But this level of strategic whiplash has naturally generated intense pushback from within traditional defense circles. The reporting highlights a severe counter-perspective from retired General Douglas Lute.
And General Lute warns that this approach is incredibly dangerous. He represents the established military perspective, which relies heavily on the historical precedents of the last 50 years.
His warning focuses on the inherent volatility of power vacuums.
Yes. Lute argues that deliberately shattering the status quo of a complex nation without any plan for what comes next is playing with fire.
You cannot destroy a society's infrastructure and its security apparatus, walk away, and assume the pieces will organically arrange themselves into a peaceful democracy.
Because nature abhors a geopolitical vacuum. When central authority vanishes, the void is rarely filled by moderate democratic reformers.
It is almost always filled by the most ruthless, heavily armed actors available.
Exactly. And playing with fire in the Middle East guarantees that the flames will spread across borders.
Which brings us to the reality on the ground in Iran right now. The high-level debate over geopolitical theory. J.D. Vance's nuclear metrics versus General Lute's warnings about power vacuums.
It can sometimes obscure the actual physical consequences of these decisions.
Yeah, the reporting details a truly grim reality currently unfolding.
The doctrinal shift is currently being measured in human lives and widespread infrastructural destruction.
While the administration uses language that suggests detachment, the kinetic reality of the air campaign is intimate and devastating for the civilian population.
The toll outlined in the reporting is staggering. Just since the specific weekend mentioned in the text, over 870 people have been killed.
Over 870. That is an enormous loss of life in an incredibly compressed time frame.
And the costs are also hitting the American military. 6 United States service members have died.
And beyond the immediate casualties, there are massive regional security indicators flashing red. The U.S. has been forced to close its embassies in both Saudi Arabia and Kuwait.
Right. Closing embassies in allied Gulf nations, that is a severe intelligence indicator.
Saudi Arabia and Kuwait are heavily fortified anchors of the U.S. security architecture in the region.
You do not evacuate diplomatic outposts in those countries unless there is credible, imminent intelligence indicating widespread, uncontainable threats.
It proves that the conflict is not isolated to Iranian territory.
The destabilization is rapidly spilling over. It's threatening regional trade, global energy markets, and the physical safety of neighboring states.
It is the exact scenario Chancellor Merz was warning about.
Exactly. And the destruction inside Iran itself is horrific. The reporting notes that the deadliest single attack thus far occurred at a girls' elementary school in southern Iran.
In the capital, Tehran, the streets are described as being littered with mangled metal and shattered glass.
The reality of the girls' school bombing and the destruction in the capital directly contradicts the sanitized language often used to describe modern warfare.
Right. Rhetoric surrounding these campaigns often utilizes terms like surgical strikes, targeted retribution, or punishment.
That language implies a clean, highly controlled operation that only impacts military infrastructure. But the physical evidence, hundreds dead, a destroyed elementary school, civilian infrastructure in ruins, demonstrates that this is a full-scale, catastrophic war.
There is no such thing as a clean state collapse.
No. And this brings us to a major strategic contradiction highlighted in the reporting.
Yeah, there's a massive disconnect between the administration's stated goals for Iran's future and the physical effects of their military campaign.
President Trump indicated a clear preference for how he envisions the aftermath. He stated he would prefer a moderate leader from within the current Iranian establishment to eventually assume control of the country.
And the logic behind desiring a moderate insider is sound on paper.
Sure. An insider possesses the institutional knowledge required to navigate the massive bureaucracy of the state. They understand how the ministries function, how to manage the civil service.
How to keep the basic utilities running.
Exactly. Theoretically, an insider could prevent the country from fracturing completely while slowly aligning the new government with Western interests.
It relies on the survival of a pragmatic middle tier of the existing government.
But the paradox lies in how the U.S. is prosecuting the war. In the exact same breath, The president noted the overwhelming scale of the military strikes, stating that they are killing so many officials that pretty soon we're not going to know anybody.
Pretty soon, we're not going to know anybody.
Right. This exposes the fatal flaw in the "we break it, they own it" execution.
The United States is publicly wishing for a moderate, experienced insider to step up and steer a peaceful transition of power.
But simultaneously, the intensity and lethality of the bombing campaign are actively eradicating the civil servants, the technocrats, and the moderate officials who could conceivably fulfill that role.
You cannot demand that the local population rebuild their nation if your military has systematically targeted and eliminated all the architects, engineers, and foremen.
It is a strategy fundamentally at war with itself. You desire a highly controlled, moderate outcome, but you are utilizing tools that guarantee uncontrolled systemic chaos.
And this dynamic is not unprecedented. The reporting makes a direct comparison to the NATO intervention in Libya in 2011.
Yeah, the 2011 Libya intervention is the most potent modern case study for the exact strategy the U.S. is currently applying to Iran.
In Libya, Western powers, led by NATO air support, provided the kinetic military force necessary to shatter the regime of Muammar Gaddafi.
They eliminated the central authority. And then, adhering closely to the "we break it, they own it" philosophy, the West largely stepped back.
The assumption was that the liberated Libyan people would organically form a stable, democratic government now that the dictator was gone.
But the reality of what happened in Libya after Gaddafi's fall was a catastrophic failure of that assumption.
The immediate aftermath in Libya was a disastrous, agonizing decade of civil war.
Because the central institutions of the state had been destroyed, and because the West provided no security framework to manage the transition, the country fractured instantly.
Warlords carved up territories. The remnants of the military fought against various militias.
Extremist groups, including ISIS affiliates, found vast safe havens in the ungoverned spaces.
The civilian population, regardless of their desire for a peaceful democracy, lacked the organization, the resources, and crucially, the monopoly on violence required to establish a new order.
And this is exactly why geopolitical experts analyzing the Iranian conflict are deeply alarmed right now. When you look at the internal dynamics of Iran today, the threat of an even worse catastrophe is overwhelming.
The administration's rhetoric banks on the Iranian people rising up, seizing control of the shattered state, and building something better.
But the brutal reality of power dynamics makes that almost impossible. In a collapsed state, power dictates reality.
Even a heavily degraded Iranian security apparatus, the surviving factions of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the internal security forces, the entrenched militias.
It will still be vastly stronger, more organized, and heavily armed compared to a populace of unarmed civilian protesters.
If the central authority is shattered, the remnants of those hardline security forces are not going to simply surrender to civilian rule.
If the United States provides zero nation-building support, no transitional security, and no institutional framework, the outcome seems grimly predictable.
It leads to an almost binary outcome.
Yeah. The first possibility is that a faction of the surviving, heavily armed security apparatus seizes control of whatever is left of the state.
Because their legitimacy would be non-existent and their grip on power tenuous, this new regime would likely be exponentially more repressive, paranoid, and brutal than the previous one in its desperate bid to maintain control.
And the second possibility is that no single faction is strong enough to conquer the others, and the Iranian state fractures completely.
This plunges 90 million people into a multi-sided, endless civil war, creating a humanitarian disaster that would destabilize the entire Middle East for a generation.
As we synthesize the reporting and the historical precedents, it becomes clear that we are looking at a macro-level shift that goes far beyond the borders of Iran.
This is a fundamental redefinition of America's role on the global stage.
The approach being applied to Iran represents a seismic departure from the identity the United States has cultivated since the end of the Second World War.
For nearly 80 years, across multiple administrations of varying political ideologies, the U.S. positioned itself often with deeply flawed execution and controversial results as the global stabilizer.
Right. The overarching doctrine was that American economic and military power was meant to uphold a specific global order, protect international shipping lanes, and manage geopolitical crises to prevent wider systemic collapse.
But the new disruptor mindset completely inverts that identity.
The philosophy operating right now is starkly utilitarian. The sole objective is to neutralize perceived immediate threats to the United States.
To achieve that, the U.S. will utilize overwhelming force to break the existing system of an adversary.
But the critical shift is the absolute categorical refusal to be the architect of whatever system replaces it.
It is the formal abdication of the global stabilizer role in favor of acting purely as a reactive, destructive force.
And the stakes of this doctrinal shift are historic. The United States is launching a devastating, highly lethal military campaign against a massive nation.
It is openly daring a foreign population of 90 million people to navigate the collapse of their society.
While simultaneously broadcasting to the world that the U.S. takes zero responsibility for their safety, their governance, or their future survival once the bombs stop falling.
It is an incredible abdication of the aftermath. And the hard truth of geopolitics is that consequences do not simply vanish just because a superpower refuses to acknowledge them.
Exactly. A shattered nation of 90 million people creates shockwaves.
The resulting refugee crises, the fracturing of global energy markets, the regional proxy wars, these events will happen.
If the burden of managing that massive fallout is not borne by the nation that initiated the conflict, it falls entirely on the civilians left standing in the rubble.
And the neighboring countries forced to absorb the blast radius.
The ripple effects of this strategy will redefine international relations. If the United States is permanently resigning from the business of managing the power vacuums it creates, the global security architecture that has defined the last century will have to be completely dismantled.
And rebuilt by the nations left dealing with the consequences.
Precisely.
Which brings us back to Chancellor Merz sitting in the Oval Office, anxious about the day after. I want to leave you with a final thought to consider as this conflict continues to unfold.
Yeah.
If the United States has permanently adopted this "we break it, they own it" philosophy, if leaving behind deliberate, unmanaged power vacuums is the new standard operating procedure, how will allied nations react?
It's the ultimate question.
Will countries in Europe, or regional powers like Israel, be forced to radically rewrite their own military and economic doctrines?
Are we entering an era where anxious allies must massively militarize and prepare to intervene themselves, simply to clean up the geopolitical messes left behind by a superpower that no longer cares about the aftermath?
It is a question that will likely define the stability of the next century.